The iOS configuration file. The iOS is the most robust and powerful network operating system in the industry, but without the expertise to manipulate its configuration files, it's nothing more than potential. A CCNA is required to have a high degree of competence in editing and copying these files. In this nugget, we're going to start out by looking at the access path to get to the configuration mode of the iOS. Then we will identify the two types of configuration commands and learn how to navigate in the configuration mode. Once we're comfortable changing the configuration parameters, we're going to define the two configuration file types and learn how to copy both of them and erase one of them. Let's get started. All right, the first thing we're going to do, if you recall from an earlier nugget, we talked about the different levels within the iOS, and they were exec levels. And what we had was we had a user exec level, and this is what you run into as soon as you log into the router. And then once we typed in the enable command, we moved into what was known as the privileged exec level. All right, once we're here, this is where we can go in a lateral move into the configuration mode. And how we do that is we type in the command, configure, and then there's going to be a space here, terminal. We're going to configure from our terminal. Once we do that, we are in the configuration mode and ready and empowered to make changes. Now, as we're going along this line, the router is going to give you some help in the prompt to let you know where you're at. When you first log into the user exec mode, you're going to get a prompt that has the host name of the router, whatever it may be. In most cases, for our nuggets, it's going to be R1, R2, R3, and so on. So let's say R1, and then this sign here lets you know that you're in the user exec mode. Once you type the enable command, provide the correct password, you move into the privileged exec mode. And that's going to be indicated with this prompt. Again, the same host name with the number sign. Okay? Once you administer this command, configure terminal, now you're going to be in host name, config inside the brackets, and that same number sign. This tells you that you're ready to configure your router. In this CCNA series, you're not only going to get the information you need in a practical format and on a whiteboard, you're also going to be able to see, in most cases, it applied in a real-world scenario. With that in mind, let's get into our router. I'm going to jump into a router here using COM1 off of my computer onto the console port as discussed in an earlier nugget. Now, once we're in there, you can see by the host name and this character that I am in the user exec mode. Now I'm going to move on up using the enable command and a password into the privileged exec mode. Now it's a lateral move using the command we talked about just a minute ago, configure from terminal. And there we have it. Now we have our host name, config, and then the number sign. Okay, now that we know how to get to our all-powerful tool, the question is now, what do we do with it once we're there? We're going to start our answer to that by looking at the command types available in the configuration mode. All right, the first one is the global command. The second is called a subcommand or subcommands. All right, let me illustrate what this means. A global command is going to take effect over the entire router. Subcommands will not take effect over the entire router, only a piece or a subset of that configuration. So let me give you an example. If I type in here, router space RIP, that is a global command. What I'm doing is I'm turning RIP on as a routing protocol on the entire router. I'm going to do that at this prompt, the host name, config, number sign. As soon as I type this in and hit enter, I am going to enter into an option or availability of subcommands, and my prompt is going to change to hostname config / router, because I'm in the subsection called router of the configuration file, and the number sign again. So any command that I issue here will now be a subcommand to this global command. Time to put these commands into action. Let's move back into our router. All right, again, I've moved up to the privileged exec mode, and here I'm going to type in configure from my terminal. All right, now I'm in the configuration mode. As we said before, I can issue the command router space RIP at this point. Now I've activated RIP on the router in a global sense, and anything that I have an option here of a command is a subcommand. Let me lengthen this box for you so you can see them all. I have within RIP auto summary, default metric, distance, distribute list, and so on as optional subcommands. All right? Let me illustrate something for you at this point. let's say that I have my global commands here. All right, what I want to understand is when I leave this global area and I move in to the area where my subcommands exist in here, specifically for router RIP, how do I move back out of this area to go to into another area? Because for sure, there are many levels of subcommands off of this global structure that exist. And what I need to be able to do is go in there, make configuration changes, come back out to the global level so that I can go into some other portion of the configuration that has subcommands as well. Because what you're going to find is I can also type in here line console 0. Now, when I do that, that is a global command that is going to change my prompt to hostname config dash line and then the number sign to let me know that I am in another portion of subcommands, this time in respect to configuring the line for console. So I need to be able to navigate myself in and out of these subcommand areas back through the global area. How am I going to do that? Let's look at our next slide. Isn't it great how that works out? All right, this slide has to do with navigation. Again, we're going to start out with our global commands. Here's our prompt. What do we do from here? We type router RIP, changes our prompt so that we know we are now in a subcommand area. And then, this is the magic word. We're going to type in exit. It's kind of tricky though, because you might assume that when you type in exit and you just entered in the configuration mode via this command, configure space terminal, that you might exit the whole configuration. But indeed you won't. Exit is just going to take you up one level from wherever you're at. So if you're in a subcommand area and you hit exit, now you're just going to go back up to the global area, hostname, config, number sign. And that's as far as you go. Now, to end the session, you have down here keywords, either end, which you can type at any area, either at the global or the subcommand level, and it'll get you out of your configuration session, or the quick key is Control Z. All right, so you ask though, what's going to happen if I'm at the global level, right here, and I type exit? It takes you up one level. It will always take you up one level, and so indeed it does exit the configure from terminal mode completely, and you'll be back at a router prompt where it's just the host name and the number sign. Time for a field trip. We're turning to router land. Okay, in our router, we're in an area where the subcommand area of the router config, right? So, as we said earlier, let's go ahead and type the word in, exit, and you see that we go back up to our global area. Now, before we move on to how we end this session for our configuration mode, I do want to show you one more thing. If I type in here, line console 0, it moves me to config-line subcommand area. I can actually move out of here and into another subcommand area by typing a global command. This isn't true of all global commands, but it is of some, so let me show you that. If I type in now router RIP, which is designed as a global command to put me in the subcommand area of the router, like I was here, and hit enter, there you go. I automatically go there. It's a pass-through through the global area. All right, now it would be nice if it was true that you had a rule that said all global commands can be administered from any portion of the configuration, and subcommands can only be administered in their sub-area, but it's just not true. Because let me give you another example here. I'm going to return, I'm going to exit back to the global level. Hit question mark. This gives me a list of all available commands at the global level. So indeed, these are global commands. The first one I have is AAA. It's used for authentication, authorization, and accounting. This is mainly used when you have dial-in type access. So okay, with that, let me Control C out of this. I'm going to get into router RIP. So I'm in a subcommand area, and now I'm going to administer the command AAA with a question mark. It says the command is completely unrecognized. Had that command been recognized, it would have given me the option of what keyword could come next. So let me backspace over my A's there, exit out of here, and now at the global mode, I can type in AAA, the same thing I did earlier, with the question mark, and there you go. It tells me my option of new model. So it would be nice if I could say that all global commands can be administered anywhere in the configuration mode, but it's just not true. There are key commands that can, and as you work with the routers, it'll become intuitive to you which commands those are. let's move forward with ending our configuration session now. I'm going to backspace over my A's. I am in the global mode. At this point, as we said, I can just type in exit, which takes me up one level. The only place to go out of here is straight out of configuration mode. Enter, and there I am, back at my router prompt. I can no longer configure from my prompt area, and it says, here's a message, configured from console by console. Let me know what I just completed. All right, let's get back in there. Configure, terminal. And it tells you, if you notice when you come in, it says you're entering configuration commands here, one per line, end with Control Z. Okay, so let's do that. Control Z. You obviously can't see me doing this, but it's going to jump back to the router prompt. And there we go. All right, the other option is to configure from terminal. And then once you're in there, type end. All right, those are the three ways to exit the configuration mode. Each of them will result in this banner, just letting you know that you just did a configuration from the console by the console. One more thing I'd like to hit on before we leave the editing portion of this nugget is to get us into our configuration mode. All right, when we were in here, I can type in router. Now, earlier I typed in RIP. This time, space, question mark, and it's going to give me all the options for the next keyword. Not only the options, which you see here, in this column, but also what each option does for me. BGP, I'm going to configure Border Gateway Protocol. EGP, it tells me all of these things, and it will do that for every level within the configuration mode, whether you're in subcommands or at the global level. You type this question mark and it'll help you. It'll even help you at varying levels in the command. If there's 5 words in the command and you have filled out 1, 2, 3 of the words, space, question mark, it will give you the options for the next set of words. I don't know any other routing software that will give you that much help. So I just wanted you to be aware that that does exist. So let's jump out of here, Control Z. All right, that'll do it for our editing portion of the configuration. Now what we need to understand is once we've edited our configuration, what do we do with those files? And actually first, what files have we edited? Let's find out. There are 2 different configuration files that we're going to find on our iOS. The first one is called the running configuration file. The next one is the startup configuration file. You know, I feel a little bit like Sesame Street. Today's special number, children, is 2. It seems that we have 2 command types and 2 configuration files. All right, the running and the startup. Now, what we're going to need to understand is where are these files stored and what is peculiar about each one. All right, with the running config, they're both running in memory, but the running config is stored in RAM. Okay, that's random access memory, and by nature, it's volatile. In other words, if I reboot my router, this area of memory is going to be zeroized, and the config that I saved here will be gone. Okay, because of that, we had a need for another config, a more permanent configuration, and that's where we have our startup configuration file. It is stored in the memory space of NVRAM. That stands for non-volatile RAM. Okay, which means that if I reboot my router, that startup config will still be in that file. And because it is, that is the configuration that I'm going to use to start my router up each time. So what's that telling me? That's saying that if I'm making changes to my configuration file and I simply make them in one file, the running config, and not in the startup config, I am good up to the point that I reboot my router, and then I am going back to an older config. All right, so if we want to verify that both of these are indeed the same, so that if we reboot the machine, we will have the same instance or the same routing happening as before we rebooted the machine, we're going to have some show commands. And the show commands are found here. There's show running-config and show startup-config. Remember that our commands rely on the syntax. If you type in show running space config, you will not get the output you're looking for. So you've got to be aware of the type of command that you're typing in and its syntax. Luckily enough, we have that question mark that we just talked about. So if you went in there and typed show space question mark, these will be 2 of the many options because there's many show commands that you're going to see. All right, well, we see where it's stored in memory, and we see why we have the 2 different configuration files. Let's jump into our router and do some experimentation with how these things work. Let's start it up. The first thing we're going to do is use our show commands, and the first one I'm going to use is show running-config. All right, once it gets done building it, we're going to see the configuration that is stored in RAM. Let me open our window a bit here so that we can see it better. Okay, you see a portion of the config, and you see a line here that says More. There's two options in advancing this. You can hit the Enter key and advance one line at a time, like you see here. And that's useful in the case that I might want to see from this line to this line. So I advanced it a line at a time because the other option is the space bar. And if I use that, I'm going to go another page into the config. And we'll do that now, which will result in the information that was stored above here moving up, which is no big deal because you can scroll back to it here, but it just might make things easier for you to know that. Okay, so we've done the show run. Now, we will look into the show startup config as well, but before we go there, I want you to take note of these exclamation points that are found throughout the configuration file. These are not commands, they're simply spacers to make this configuration more readable. And in some cases, you will see the exclamation point followed by some verbiage. If you do, it's still not a command. This exclamation point means anything on this line is simply a comment, has no bearing on the configuration of the iOS. As promised, now we're going to move into the show startup dash config. All right, this is going to build faster than it did for the show running config, and the reason for that is NVRAM is it's faster to access than RAM. Okay, but the configuration file is going to be exactly the same. Here we see our more option. I spacebar there, and I have the end of the configuration file. This time it matched, and it's a good thing that it did, but it won't always. So what we're going to do is we're going to force an instance where they don't match and then view the differences between the two. Prior to doing that, though, I want to show you a couple of commands that if you've worked with routers at all, you may have seen before. The first one is show config. A lot of people will type this out, and voila, what do you get? You get a copy of our configuration file. The trouble with that command is when I say show config, now that you know that there are two types of configuration files, which one is this? There is no indication after I type in the command what it is. And that is exactly the reason that they changed the commands. This is an old command set. And if you run into people that have worked with routers for a long time, they may use that. Don't get confused and don't think that it's something different than what you're used to dealing with within the iOS. It's simply showing the configuration file, but in this case, it is showing the configuration file out of NVRAM. So that is the startup config. And you might see other people come up and say, right, space, terminal. And when that happens, you're going to build a configuration file. Now, the hint here is it stopped and paused for building the configuration file, didn't it? That kind of tells you that it's the running config because it's building it in RAM. All right, so here we go, and there's our configuration file as well. Just don't get confused on those commands. Now let's move forward with making our two configuration files not match. We're going to move into configure from our terminal. Oh, you know what? Sorry about that. Let me add my F and I. Configure from terminal. All right. And we're going to add an access list. Don't worry so much about what an access list does, although I'm going to tell you, pay particular attention to the fact that it's going to be in the config or it's not going to be in the config depending on which one we look at. An access list is the way that a router will filter traffic, either inbound or outbound, in one of its interfaces. And depending on the parameters you put in there, you'll either do one of two things, permit or deny that traffic. All right, so let me type it in. Access dash list 1. We're going to permit a host as a source, and the address is 192.168.1. Let's go for .253. All right, once we enter that, we're going to Control Z out of the configuration mode, and now, once we get the message that we configured from the console, I'm going to show running dash config. Building it up. Now on the second page of this configuration, we're going to see the line that I just added. And in fact, here it is. Access list 1 permit 192.168.1.253. It is in the running command. So this lets you know that as soon as I type a command into the configuration mode, it goes into RAM. Does it go into our startup config? Let's find out. Show startup dash config. Okay, second page, and it doesn't, because this is exactly where we would normally see See that line? We're in need of a tool again, aren't we? We need a tool that will take the configuration parameters that are in our running config and move them into our startup config. This is how we're going to do that. Let's go back to our slides. We're going to use the copy command. All right, the copy command is going to have two sections in it. First, the keyword copy, and then two sections after that. The options in the first section are TFTP, running config, or startup config. This section is our from section. So we're going to copy from one of these sections, and then here we have the to section. It mirrors what we had here, TFTP, running config, or startup config. All right, so one of the available options might be copy, running config, to startup config, and this will alleviate the problem we just had. We populated in our configuration mode some new commands. It automatically took that into RAM, but didn't do anything with NVRAM. And with this copy command, we'll get that done. We'll port that data across. So you might be asking yourself here, why am I made to duplicate my effort? I put commands into the configuration mode. They're populated in RAM. They should automatically be set into NVRAM as well. No, and you'll be thankful for this as you work more with routers. There will come a time that you're doing some complicated configuration within a router, and as you add different entries, you're pretty sure that it's not going to affect adversely anything else in the router, but it may. In fact, some entries, if you're working with access lists, the example I just gave you, may lock you out of a router so you can't access it any longer. All right, well, in the scenario that we are given here, we would make those entries in configuration mode. They would move into RAM automatically. And as soon as they move in there, they take effect immediately. When that happens, we're locked out of the router. Now what do? Are you stuck? You're not, and this is why. Remember, this is temporary memory. If you'll reboot that router, you're going to go back to the configuration you had in your startup here, which was the configuration you had right before making those changes in the configuration mode. Pretty slick, right? This is going to save you in a number of times. And at least, even if it doesn't save you and you've done everything correctly where you didn't lock yourself out, it still gives you that peace of mind of knowing that, you know, I'm going to try these configurations. If for some reason something goes wrong, it's simply a reboot. Let's take a trip into our router now so we can use our copy command. First one, copy. Now we need a source running. Only two ends. We're running too far. Running dash config into our startup config. All right, it's going to build the configuration, and what we're going to see now is that when we look at the startup config, it will have that same access list entry that we showed in the running config. And here we go, show startup dash config. All right, second page, there it is. Access list 1 permit 192.168.1.253. Now both of our configuration files match. We haven't used the TFTP option of our command yet for copying. All right, you've got to remember that as we're copying information from RAM to NVRAM, it happens within the router. Let's say this is R1. We also have our configuration mode as a part in that router. There's going to be an instance where you want to take configuration files either from NVRAM or RAM, deliver them to a separate PC, and write them for storage, for backup, if you will, in case we ever need to bring them back over. The way we're going to make that happen is through the TFTP protocol, Trivial File Transfer Protocol. It's FTP, but it's in a trivial sense, which means we're going to use a connectionless type of connection here, UDP. We're going to study that more in a later nugget. Just understand now that it's the avenue we use to get configuration files from a router to another PC and then back again. And it can be copied, remember, from either of these, because looking at our command, the source can be running or startup and still have the destination of TFTP. Let's take a look at how that works on the router. All right, we're going to copy. Our source is going to be the startup config in this instance, TFTP. It's going to ask me some questions here. First thing, the remote host. It wants an IP address, 192.168.1.254. Remember, that's not an IP address that you're going to find on the router. That's an IP address of the PC that I'm working on. Let's hit enter. It's going to ask you for a name of the configuration file, R1-CONFG. You can use the default as long as it's intuitive to you what that file is coming from. So if you have a number of routers, as long as there's not two that are named R1, you're fine. So let's take that. All right, now it's going to ask you one more time, are you sure you want to do this? And indeed we are. So here we go. The first thing that happens on my server, it asks me, do you want to accept this? And then once I do accept it, it says transfer of R1 CONFG has successfully completed. Okay, I am storing everything on my PC under a TFTP directory. Let me show it to you. I'm going to go in here and find C TFTP, and there it is, R1-CONFG. You can open this up with WordPad, and there you go. The configuration that we saw on the router now is a file on my PC. The cool thing here, you can actually edit this file. If I wanted to, I could add another access list line here, and when I port this back to my router, it'll show up. So let's do that. Access-list 1 permit 192.168.1. And this time we're going to allow 254. All right, let's save that file. Yes, I want to save it. And then we're going to move along. And what we're going to do this time is get into the router, and we're going to use the copy command again. But what we're going to do is use a different source, this time the TFTP, and we're going to copy it into our startup config. I'm sorry, not copy. We're going to put it into our startup config. Let's make that happen. Again, it's going to ask me for an address, 192.168.1.254. It's going to ask for the name of the configuration this time that it needs to grab. Use the default, ask me if I'm sure, and I am. Let me grant access for that router to come in and grab that configuration. All right, going back to the router, we're going to let it run through its system and then show startup config. Second page is what we're looking for, and there you go. Check it out. We've got both lines now of our access list, which we didn't have before. Okay, and if we go ahead and show our running config now, show running config, we're going to see that it differs, especially when we're talking about the access list there. It has just the one entry. So if we're coming from a TFTP server this way, we might want to add that. Now before we issue the command copy the source of the startup config and the destination of the running config, I want to talk about something. All right, here, if we're copying to NVRAM or TFTP, it's an overwrite. In other words, whatever file we're bringing from RAM over to either of these two destinations, it's going to overwrite the existing file. Even if we're going from NVRAM to TFTP, it's an overwrite. There's an exception to that. If you're going from either of these destinations and you're copying to RAM, it doesn't overwrite it. What it does is it's kind of a hybrid. And this gets a little bit confusing, and as you work with the routers more, you'll learn more what's going to change and what's not. But a portion of the commands will change. An example of that would be, let's say hostname. There can be only one hostname on a router config, right? So if you're copying from TFTP over to RAM, and in TFTP the hostname is R2, and in RAM it was R1, it's going to copy over this as it existed in RAM, and you'll now see it as R2. But if you're working with access lists, like we typed in earlier, there can be multiple lines within the instance of access list 1. So, we had one permit line in TFTP, and let's say that we had one permit line in RAM, but they were different IP addresses, 192.168.1.1, and this one is .2 in that 4th octet. What's going to happen is when you bring the TFTP config in, this line, into the existing RAM config, which has this line here, it's going to have both lines in the configuration in RAM. So it adds these two. So in some instances, it will overwrite a specific entry. In others, it's simply going to append it to the end of either an access list or some other list that has multiple entries. Looking back at our router, we can finish our command now, and that's going to be to copy the startup config that we collected from the TFTP server into the running config. so that we'll have a matching configuration on both instances. All right, we're going to let it build up, and then we're going to do a show run. And make sure that we have both access list entries on the second page. And there you go, we do. All right, so now you have seen ways of copying from RAM to NVRAM, NVRAM over to a TFTP server, making modifications on our configuration, and then bringing it back over to NVRAM, and then copying it from NVRAM into our RAM, which is the copy from the startup config into our running config. And you also know the caveat that when you do that, there is a bit of a difference when you copy things into RAM than into the other two instances. All right, let's go back, and what we need now is an understanding of, once we've copied it, how can we erase configurations? And we're going to do that by using the erase command. As you can see, it's a pretty straightforward command. We've got erase, and then the portion of memory that we want to erase, the startup config. Unfortunately, there's not an option for erase the running config. You almost wish there was, because we just went over a rule that said some entries in my running config, when I copy, let's see, running configs in RAM, when I copy from my startup config into this RAM, some of those entries won't be replaced if they already existed here, right? So you wish you had a tool that allowed you to erase RAM and then copy startup into that piece of memory. Well, you can't do that because it's actually the operating system that you're running, and if you erased it, then you couldn't go to the next step of copying because there would be no configuration in RAM. So it's not possible. The use that you're going to get out of this erase command is to erase the startup config, and once you do that, if you reboot the machine, then you're going to be into a mode that's called setup mode. We're going to deliver the setup mode in another nugget, but I am going to show you on the router now how we would erase, and then from there you could take the reboot and move into setup mode. All right, let's do that. Here we find our router. We get to a router prompt. We're going to erase startup config. All right, what it's going to say after it's done working is just going to give you another router prompt, and then we're going to try to show the startup config on our own. Show startup dash config, and it's going to tell us that there's nothing there. Non-volatile configuration memory has not been set up. All right, so it did effectively erase it. We can now come in with a TFTP server and set a config in there, or copy it from RAM, or we could simply reload here, and like I said, it's going to get you into the setup mode, which is a different nugget. In this nugget, we looked at the access path, or how we'll navigate through our router to get to the configuration mode. We also looked at the two command types. One was a global, and the other was a subcommand. We used the exit command to navigate in the configuration mode. It brought us up one level, from subcommand to global. And because it does that, it could take us from global out of the configuration mode, along with Control-Z or the end statement. Then we looked at configuration file types, the running config and the startup config. We learned how to copy them to each other and also via TFTP to another server. It can be used for storage and backup. The files could be edited and brought back to the router for use. Last, we looked at erasing the startup configuration. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.